Good day, everyone, and welcome. It's springtime in the year 2023. The trees are leafing out, and the song sparrows and the hermit thrushes are singing. My name's Jeff Titon, and I'm going to talk to you for about 20 minutes today about why I do applied ethnomusicology. I'd like to define applied ethnomusicology as the application of ethnomusicological knowledge to practical problem solving within musical communities. Applied ethnomusicology has a history. It also has a bias toward cultural equity, toward musical diversity, and toward social responsibility. My work in applied ethnomusicology has moved in the past dozen years or so from the arena of people making music to the more inclusive arena of beings making sound. Since my appeal for a sound commons for all living creatures in 2012, and my essay on the sound of climate change in 2016, I've been thinking about this new field of eco-ethnomusicology, the term is Jennifer Post's, and its possible applications amidst the current climate emergency. I started on the road to applied ethnomusicology in grad school, though I didn't have a name for it then. If I thought about it at all, I thought about it as an outgrowth of friendship. This was when I was a guitarist in Lazy Bill Lucas's blues band. In the 1960s, Bill and Mojo Buford and JoJo Williams had all moved to Minneapolis from Chicago, where they'd been a part of the Chicago blues scene. Minneapolis presented them with more opportunities and less competition. Bill and his friends kind of adopted me into their blues community. I received the gift of their friendship, and I reciprocated. And then in 1968 and 1969, I interviewed Bill and Mojo and JoJo, got their oral histories published in the British blues magazine called Blues Unlimited. That free publicity helped their careers, and it helped put the band on the road to 2 record albums and appearances at various festivals, including the 1970 Ann Arbor Blues Festival. Why did I do it? We were friends. We did things that friends do with each other and for each other to help each other. Later in the last century, as many of you know, I undertook collaborative ethnography in marginalized musical communities, both to add to the storehouse of knowledge and also to serve those communities in maintaining and understanding their musical traditions. Those partnerships were successful, and actually they're ongoing. 40 years now for 2 of them and 25 years for the third one. And then early in our current century, I began to develop an ecological approach to musical and cultural sustainability. I was fortunate to have had some training in ecology when I was in college and in grad school. And in the 1980s, I'd written about music cultures as ecosystems. But the idea didn't gain any traction then, and I just set it on the back burner. Like other ethnomusicologists, I thought about musical communities anthropocentrically then, in terms of people making music. But when in the new century I began thinking ecologically again, it was from an ecocentric perspective. And so I was drawn to the Earth's entire sonic community, the sounds of all the living beings, humans, plants, animals, landforms, and the geophysical forces such as wind and water in our biosphere. Human-made music is, of course, an important part of our whole sonic planet. All I did was to decenter it. And so if you're willing to grant that music is a special case of that larger category, sound, then consider that the human musical community is a special case of the more inclusive category of sonic communication among all the Earth's living creatures. Music may or may not confer an evolutionary advantage on human beings, but plainly sound communication does. In what follows, I'd like to consider an ecocentric expansion of applied ethnomusicology from a focus on human musical communities to that one that is more inclusive, all the sonic communities with whom our fate and the fate of the planet is bound up. The name for this expanded orientation might be called applied ecomusicology, where the eco in ecomusicology signals ecology, or it might be called applied ecomusic, I'm sorry about that. It might be called applied eco-ethnomusicology, or terminology, a term invented by my colleague Jennifer Post, as I mentioned earlier. Post, like most ecomusicologists coming from ethnomusicology, concentrates on the ecosonic knowledge of indigenous peoples and their applications. Other applied ecomusicologists have undertaken environmental justice projects, sometimes working along those who sing for the environment. My research is oriented in the direction of eco-justice, which views environmental justice as a part of the more inclusive and ecocentric justice that seeks justice not just for marginalized human communities, but for those communities and for all living beings. To that end, I've theorized a project that I've been calling a sound ecology, a thought experiment based in the visceral fact of sonic presence and sound connections among all living creatures, direct connections that form the basis for sound communities and for a sound economy, where sound refers both to the acoustic phenomenon and also to health and wholeness. I've already written extensively about that project, so my aim here is more modest, to give you an introduction to some methods and problems in studying these inclusive sonic communities, and to say a few words about some practical applications. But first, let me tell you a short story, the listening equivalent of what we usually call a vision. At an ecomusicology conference in Asheville, North Carolina, in the spring of 2014, the musicologist Denise von Glahn posed a question to Aaron Allen, Mark Peddlety, and me. She asked, "What is the music of climate change?" She had in mind musical compositions about nature, compositions that responded to global warming. I took her question as an opportunity to think about the sounds of nature. And 6 months later, in a great wind and snowstorm on the Maine coast where I live, I felt that I was experiencing the sounds of climate change in that storm. Fast falling, heavy, wet snow combined with winds of 40 knots. The ground was already wet and loose from the October rains. I stood out on the porch in the middle of the wind and snowstorm, taking it all in, all the whistles and whooshes and scrapes and roars, listening to the forest's grand aeolian harp that for hours dominated the soundscape. The big branches of the tall, slender spruce trees moved back and forth in the gale. The needles were piling up with wet snow, looking like so many Shivas waving their arms about. I heard a loud crack, and I knew at once it was a spruce trunk snapping in two. I saw it go, a big one, at the edge of the forest 100 yards away, 2/3 of it broken off and crashing down across the path into the woods. The next day, I counted 35 snapped trees, their trunks strewn across my trail through the forest. The carnage included a few apple trees that were young during the panic of 1893. Then a bloated economy fell victim to unsound financing. People didn't understand, as ecological economists do now, how economic growth is constrained by environmental limits. Today, the environment lays claim to our incurred debt through the currency of climate change. In the presence of nature, I heard the sound of climate change, and I experienced its solemn, terrifying beauty. I felt the slow panic of the 21st century eco-sublime, nature's market adjustment writ large. Now, the scientists who study animal sound communication have a not very technical term for what I had done: eavesdropping. You may have heard that animals, some animals anyway, rob the nests of others. Squirrels, for example, steal and eat the young from blue jay nests. If a blue jay sees danger in a squirrel too close to its nest, it makes an alarm sound. This sound not only warns its mate, it also warns members of other species nearby. And those other species are the eavesdroppers. And so, listening to the sounds of the devastating storm, I came to the conclusion that I was eavesdropping on nature's alarm call. I'd heard it for years, but now I was hearing it in a new context, namely climate change. I took it for a sign and as a personal call to action. Now, the study of sonic communication among non-human beings is a very lively field at present. But the field is dominated by evolutionary biologists who assume that animals are aware but not self-conscious, that animals have brains, but they don't have minds. Compared with human beings, non-human animals are said to lack intentionality, experience, language, thought, and culture. The evolutionary biologists view sounds within a behaviorist framework, pure stimulus and response. Sounds function simply to increase the likelihood of survival or fitness. Animals don't think, they only act and react. In response to sounds, animal behavior is automatic and predictable. These assumptions about animals present roadblocks if we would do traditional ethnographic inquiry. If animals are mindless automatons without consciousness or experience, then they can't have anything that corresponds to a native point of view. But on the other hand, our own experiences with other mammals challenge this claim. If you live with a dog, you treat the dog as if it has desires, shows feelings, and has memories, and indeed you think it does have desires, that it does show its feelings, and that it does have memories, although not always. Dogs seem to undergo experience, but in their own dog-like ways. Animals' experiential worlds are, for us, alien. They're difficult, if not impossible, for us to access, except through observation and inference. Following the pioneering biologist Jacob von Uexküll, we may say that animal experience takes place within the parameters of their Umwelt, or the affordances that the environment offers to them, and that given the nature of their bodies and their resulting environmental perceptions, including sonic perceptions, they do have particular points of view. And if we do grant that animals are at least sentient beings with points of view, we can begin to understand their behavior through the means of ecological psychology, all without needing to access their inner worlds, whatever those inner worlds might be. We do so by what's called direct social perception and by direct perception empathy. Direct social perception theory asserts that we have a direct and immediate perceptual grasp of other beings' moods, dispositions, and intentions as embodied in their experience, in their appearance and their actions. This perceptual grasp comes directly after observation and before any reflective reasoning about it. This is how most social behavior goes along in ordinary life anyway. We respond to the behavior of other beings immediately and without puzzling over it or needing to read their minds. Scientists, incidentally, have observed direct social perception among other mammals besides humans. Now, direct perception empathy is similarly something that occurs prior to any reflection on it. When you see someone smile at you, you smile back without thinking about it. The embodied action produces an immediate empathic imitation, which enables a direct perception of the other's mental state. If you encounter a barking dog, you immediately perceive whether it's friendly or it's not. The dog also perceives directly whether you're afraid or not. Of course, direct social perception and direct perception empathy can mislead. That is, misperception can and does occur. But misperception or not, the fact is that direct social perception and direct perception empathy occur in ordinary social intercourse all of the time. Now, how might direct social perception and direct perception empathy occur in plants and animals, and specifically in their sonic behavior? Consider birdsong. Two birds in a song duel over territory or over a prospective mate perceive directly and immediately such things as the opponent's strength and its likelihood of prevailing in a fight. We know that birds communicate in sounds to mark territories, to attract mates, to announce their presence, to keep the flock together, and to sound alarms, among other things. Now, anyone who claimed that a bird is lamenting when singing tirelessly after the death of its mate would get nowhere with evolutionary biologists. They deny that the bird that seems to sing its heart out in pain or in pleasure does so with anything like emotion or aesthetic feelings. And yet, it turns out that neuroscientists in the current century have discovered that birds may well have emotions. The genetic determinism of the last century seems increasingly dated today. Recent experiments in neuroscience not only confirm the operation of direct social perception and direct perception empathy in animal sound communication, but also speak to this question of emotion and aesthetic pleasure. When a female songbird hears the song of her mate, she perceives and identifies it immediately as the cry of her companion. Upon examining the brains of female birds just after hearing the songs of their mates, neurobiologists Donna Maney and Sarah Earp discovered that their brains released dopamine, a chemical associated in human brains with pleasure and well-being. They wrote, quote, "All humans know what it feels like to hear their favorite song or a discordant racket. The results of our present study suggest that to songbirds, hearing a song may result in similar emotional experiences," unquote. Moreover, experiments with mirror neurons confirm the operation of direct perception empathy at the neurological level. Mirror neurons are a particular type of neuron that discharge both upon doing an action and also when perceiving that another same species being is doing the same action. The result of this direct perception empathy is imitation, the involuntary smile in response to another's smile. Now, it turns out that the songbird brain has a high density of these mirror neurons. Sonic communication among most songbirds is learned behavior, the songbirds imitating or mirroring the songs and calls of their parents. These neural circuits, Earp claimed, are the same in birds as in humans. And so their experiments offer evidence to suggest that not only direct social perception and direct perception empathy operates among birds, but also that because human brains are similarly wired, it may not be so far-fetched to assume that birds lament for their lost companions, or that they experience pleasure when they hear the song of their mate, or fear when they hear alarm calls, and so on. In short, direct social perception and direct perception empathy open a pathway for the eco-ethnomusicologist to begin to comprehend an expressive culture of sound communication in animals, alien in some ways, but eerily similar in others. Indeed, certain theories of indigenous ontology and epistemology, such as the perspectivism championed by Viveiros de Castro, emphasize these continuities, claiming that animals that live in social groups think of themselves as human beings living in families and communities. And yet, although environmental planners increasingly recognize the values of traditional indigenous relations with nature, if ethnomusicologists proposed solutions at an environmental policy meeting that were based in such perspectivist worldviews, we would be laughed out of the room. To advocate practical solutions in the current political climate, at any rate, I believe we'll all be better served by finding complementary aspects of Western scientific and indigenous and traditional ecological sonic knowledges, sometimes relying on dissenting Western scientific traditions, such as Gaia theory, within an overall ecological rationality. Given this brief overview of an eco-ethnomusicological approach to animal sound communication, let me mention one pathway that may help us begin to think about what an applied eco-ethnomusicology might be. It puts us on the road to sound equity by means of what I've termed the sound commons. A commons is a resource which is shared but not owned. A sound commons is a physical place, a landscape whose soundscape is shared by all its inhabitants, where they communicate sonically in their acoustic niches without undue interference from other sounds. That is sonic equity. Now here's an example of a sound commons gone badly awry. In Labrador, northern Canada, 10 years ago, a new sound came to the George River, where the indigenous Innu people traditionally hunt caribou for food and clothing. It was the sound of helicopters flying through the air and bringing in mining company executives and, later, prospectors and equipment. According to George Rich, an Innu elder, quote, "The sound of the choppers really is a devastating sound because the caribou don't know where to look. All these choppers are going flying all over the place," unquote. As a result, the caribou changed their migration route and they went away from the George River and the traditional Innu hunting grounds. And now, without caribou, the Innu get their food shipped to them in the summer when the waters are open or flown into them in winter. But again, according to George Rich, quote, "That's created a lot of problems in our diet, eating junk food," unquote. The result among the Innu is a diabetes epidemic. Helicopter noise broke the sound commons and was bad not only for the Innu, but also for the caribou, whose population declined. If you follow the animal rights movement, you know that individuals and groups have sued, sometimes successfully, on behalf of the rights of nature, not just for animal species, but also for ecosystems such as rivers and lakes. The concept of the sound commons, then, offers an opportunity to work on behalf of sonic equity for all living creatures. For example, ecomusicologist Mark Peddlety worked with the sound commons concept to advocate successfully on behalf of orcas in the Pacific Northwest coast. In other practical applications, I introduced the sound commons in acoustic planning for urban development in downtown Portland, Oregon. Excuse me. Another practical application for the sound commons would be in the siting of wind turbines on land and on sea. Summing up, I've briefly spoken to three considerations that can put applied ethnomusicology on a more ecocentric pathway. One was the oral epiphany I had while listening to the sounds of climate change. The second was an overview of a phenomenological ethnographic alternative to the behaviorist paradigm of animal sound communication. And the third is the concept of the sound commons, which I believe has many applications for applied ethnomusicologists who want to extend their field of practical action from communities of people making music to the whole earth community of beings making sound. Of course, I'm not suggesting that applied ethnomusicologists stop working with people making music. I'm only suggesting that some of us consider expanding the scope of applied ethnomusicology in a less anthropocentric and a more ecocentric direction. Thank you.